Hello and welcome to the Saltcast. My name is Ryan Johnson, your host, and once again I've got Jason Parr, Danny Wright, and Paul Johnson with me. Welcome, guys.
Hey, Ryan.
Hey.
It's always good to see you guys. Always fun to chat, even if it's about sales tax. So great for you guys to be here with me. So today, I think we can have a great discussion. You know, with our What's Next calls, we get a lot of people on the phone, and a lot of times what brings them to us is they have heard of economic nexus, they've heard of the Wayfair in the Supreme Court and the decisions that were made there, and they're worried that they may now have nexus and they may have to get registered. But as we all know, what often gets overlooked is physical nexus. You know, with the pandemic and other recent developments, I thought you guys could, you know, help us understand physical nexus and what implications could be there for different businesses.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. You know, almost universally, we cover a lot of questions and a lot of different issues. Some people call them problems. Issues related to sales tax specifically. But almost universally, the first question that we answer on a What's Next call, or we want to answer, and that we believe every seller should ask themselves, is, do I have Nexus? And when it comes to that question, universally, the response is related to economic nexus, right, because of Wayfair in South Dakota. So that economic nexus legislation was effective July of 2018. And then now we have seen every state except the Show Me State, right, has initiated some sort of economic nexus legislation. And so now that's what people are thinking about. That's what they're worried about. We've always said with economic nexus, the issue is where your customers are located, right? Prior to economic nexus, the question was, where are my operations, right? Where are my people? Where's my inventory? Where are my places of business? These were questions that were pretty common to determine if you had nexus, and really the states didn't have the ability to impose their laws on you for collection and remittance unless you had some level of physical presence. And so anyway, I go back to the idea, most people are concerned about economic nexus, and they should be. So I don't want to diminish that idea, but what ends up happening is we go through the process of, do I have nexus? And, of course, economic thresholds are important, but then we begin to ask some questions about where their business operations are located. We ask questions about inventory. For example, a seller on Amazon that's fulfilled by Amazon potentially has inventory in 30 different states because of fulfillment centers and the movement of that inventory. That's sometimes not recognized or understood. And that happens quite a bit, actually. And the thing that probably is most important here in the last year is during the pandemic, a lot of companies, I don't know the percentage, but a lot of companies have determined that remote workforce works very well. They were forced to do it, and now a lot of them may continue to do it. But one thing that might be overlooked when doing that is the fact that having an employee in another state working for your company creates sales tax nexus from a physical presence standpoint. So you could legitimately have an employee working in a state where you do not exceed the economic thresholds, and you might feel like, I'm good in that state, but you actually have nexus because you have an employee working in that state. And so I think that's something that we need to highlight, and I for the most part, everyone needs to know, if they could learn anything from this podcast, is physical presence is still the law of the land, and every state has a physical presence law or statute indicating their ability to require you to register with the state for sales tax purposes and collect and remit tax on your sales of products and services. Probably Danny sees more than anyone else in our What's Next calls, people who are coming to talk to us about economic nexus, and then in the process of the conversation, answering the very first question that we ask, do I have nexus, finds out that they potentially have physical nexus. And the reason it's a big deal is because physical nexus has been the law. And so if you have physical nexus, and that was established 10 years ago, that's significantly different by way of how you get compliant versus a state where you exceeded an economic threshold and their effective date was sometime in 19 or 20. Significant difference in potential exposure in those types of situations and how we handle helping companies get compliant. But Danny or Paul, maybe you guys have an example of what you've seen out there by way of this hitting sellers in the marketplace.
Yeah, a couple interesting examples. Well, one would be more just, I'd say, a common misconception or confusion around physical nexus, like you said, being the law of the land, and as it existed for decades, and the fact that now economic nexus laws have been passed in most of the states, and it didn't wipe out physical nexus, right? It's more, I think the way that makes sense for a lot of people to explain is that it added another layer, right? It's just another way that you can establish nexus. And one of the confusions or points of confusion that has come from that is I talk to a lot of people that say, okay, physical nexus, economic nexus, and they now think that physical nexus has a threshold attached to it. Right? So it's important to understand that, look, physical nexus is nexus. If you have it, there's no threshold that applies to you. Right, at that point that you establish physical presence and a nexus, your sales are, subject to tax, and you're responsible to collect that tax from your customers. So that's one point. Another issue that we see is, in fact, we just talked to a company yesterday, Paul and myself, on a What's Next call. We were discussing with them. This is a company that was referred to us by a CPA, and they were pretty much ignorant, like completely ignorant to economic nexus laws. And I just say that, in fact, they just didn't really know about them, and they certainly didn't understand them. So we were having that conversation around economic nexus. Like many e-commerce companies, they experienced tremendous growth in the last couple of years. They were already on some good growth and leading up to last year, and then of course just really took off last year. So they have economic nexus in probably at least a couple dozen states. They happen to have physical presence in a particular state. It was California, and they moved from California a couple of years ago, and it was almost a reverse of what we commonly see, where they had physical presence, they left, and then they're like, oh good, we don't have to deal with California anymore. However, they do north of $1 million worth of sales every year in California. So it's like, they were talking about shutting down their account and being done with California, and we're like, sorry guys, you're not done with California. So there a couple key points. That one was a little unique, but still that it's just it hits on that concept of like, look, one or the other, right? What nexus is nexus, however you've established it, right? You got to understand the difference between the two, but the fact that they exist, and you could have nexus in one way or another, and it's important to look at the big picture. And there's also the issues of the complexity around what we're talking about here with physical nexus, and how remote workers relates to that, and is certainly a factor in determining that. And that's one that's tough to dive into on a podcast like this, just because it's one of those where there's ambiguity. Obviously, there's gray area. It's like most things with sales tax, right? It depends on the state. But I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing more discussion among the states and or within the states, and maybe even some legislation come across, because when you have such a huge windfall, right, such a large change in something that affects Nexus and sales tax, like it's if we're discussing it and it's on our minds, then it's likely the states are doing the same.
You shared something that's a good reminder for everybody. Sometimes on a What's Next call, we have bad news to share, right? Sometimes the answer to the questions that we're wanting you to have answers to, doesn't go the direction that you want it to go, right? Do I have Nexus? I don't think I have Nexus in California. Well, actually, you do have Nexus in California. That's bad news if you think you've done what you need to do to avoid Nexus, and it's why we say we want to talk to everybody. But just because there's some bad news doesn't mean that it's all bad, right? The good news is we have ways to help you get set up and get compliant, with our ultimate goal being to limit any dollars out of pocket with penalty and interest. So our efforts are always to minimize that, but get you in the right place from a compliance standpoint. And that's just a good example. Paul has said over and over and over again, the most costly mistake you can make is just simply avoiding compliance or avoiding the subject altogether and not learning what your responsibility might be. And then you kind of broached another one, which is the other thing we see in remote workforces is the real potential of income tax, state income tax nexus. And, most states had some sort of legislation that was passed or a moratorium on the Nexus rules around their state income tax laws because of the pandemic. But now that companies have determined that remote workforce works for them, I can see states reversing that as we come out of the pandemic, and that could create some additional responsibilities for companies from an income tax standpoint as well.
It's quite interesting as we live in St. George, at least Danny and I, we're seeing a lot of growth in St. George, and I think it's for that very reason of remote workforces. People are realizing that they don't have to work in the big cities anymore. They can work remote, and that's working for them and working for companies. I think that's going to be a much hotter issue going forward. I mean, we were very familiar with a lot of our clients that are based out of New York that had employees that lived in New Jersey or Massachusetts or surrounding states. And now, because they're working there, they have, income tax nexus and income tax legislation that applies to them in those states where they're working. And people often don't realize that because you have employees working in other states, then that's established a physical nexus for you. It's established physical nexus, which requires you now to collect tax on those transactions where you may not previously have done so. But I think the other thing that Danny kind of touched on as well was when it comes to establishing Nexus, just because you've established Nexus doesn't necessarily mean you should go out and get registered right away. It makes sense, like on that call we were on just yesterday or the day before. I mean, they established Nexus 10 years ago or a large amount of time, many years ago. And so if they registered today, then, they're opening themselves up under audit for the state to go back when they establish Nexus. So, I mean, it's important to consider all of the pros and the cons of registering or not registering, taking a look at taxability, taking a look at the volume of sales, what kind of sales liability you do have. You established Nexus, but you only made 3 sales. So, if I don't register, then I'll have to pay that tax out of my own pocket, but maybe that's worth it for you from a cost-benefit analysis rather than registering and paying the fees in order to be compliant in the various states. So,
yeah,
don't ignore it. Don't ignore it.
By the way, that Paul, I just want to mention that was a good catch that you made there. I just want the audience to know that Paul has different measurement metrics that are more ambiguous
This is true.
Kind of hard
This is
to
true.
identify. The two measurements that I see him use is buku and the plural
Bukus.
version, bukus,
Uh-huh.
and then also a skosh. And there can be multiple skosh in,
This is true.
in measurement.
This is true.
So these units of measurement we don't understand, but when he uses those terms, we know that he means significant or very, very minor.
This is true.
Let's give some examples. Like, I see a picture behind Paul, or maybe he's standing off to the side just a little bit of the camera, and it's like, hey,
Yeah.
Paul, move just a skosh,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Like,
just move
I
just
mean,
a skosh. You know?
just move
Just
that,
a skosh.
that picture frame. You're hanging it, and your spouse is like, move it just a little, just a skosh to the left, right? That's a good example. Then you guys
Or
heard
you
a
could
great
say-
example of bukus. It's like
No, wait.
someone has
Or you-
Nexus going back several years. I mean, that's bukus.
Buku's amount.
Lots of
Buku's
years.
Yeah.
You could also move the picture just a few skoshes. Okay? It's not just one skosh, it's a few skoshes, just a little bit more.
Yeah.
Or you
It's
could
an
just have,
ambiguous term,
yeah.
measurement, but
You're welcome.
important in communicating what you're thinking. So,
I almost said bukus, but then I didn't realize. I don't know if people would have understood it. But if in the context, you could use context clues. It's what I teach my daughter all the time. Honey, you got to use context clues to understand what the words are. People would be able to figure it out. I'm certain.
yeah, no, I noticed the catch. That's why I congratulated you, so that our audience could understand what you were saying versus questioning what you might be saying. Brian, you better cut us off, sir.
Listen, I think this is the most exciting part of the podcast sometimes. But yeah, I think the examples you guys gave from What's Next call, I think perfectly exemplifies what you can see on a What's Next call. Because you can search out and research everything you may need to do, and you might think that you have it figured out. But, to get kind of on a call with us and get customized advice to your exact situation can be extremely helpful and help avoid any very costly mistakes. But if What's Next call sounds right for you, and I think it's right for everybody, go ahead and schedule your time down in the link below, and get on the call with us. It won't hurt. It can only help. And once again, thank you guys so much for being on with me today, and we hope to see you guys on another one.
Thanks, Ryan.